Welcome to Two Jews, One Opinion, a podcast where we sit down with Jews of all backgrounds to have real, honest, and productive conversations. We all know the famous saying, two Jews, three opinions. But what if that's just a myth? What if, deep down, we're more alike than we think? Today, Jewish unity feels more urgent than ever. But real unity? It's more than just posturing or outward displays. It's about breaking through misconceptions, tearing down assumptions, and truly understanding one another. I believe as Jews, our connections run far deeper than the differences that seem to divide us. So join me on this journey, where we're shattering the myth of endless opinions and revealing the truth. Two Jews, one opinion. Let's get real, let's get honest, and most importantly, let's get united. So glad we're here today. Judging others is as old as Jewish tradition itself. Let's dive into what Judaism and the Torah have to say about judgment. Our two guests have some history in dealing with this topic. Andrew Parker is the founder and managing partner of Parker Daniels Kibort, a top litigation law firm headquartered in downtown Minneapolis. With over 3 decades of legal experience, Parker has led legal teams in high-profile lawsuits and served as trial counsel in numerous multi-million-dollar cases involving civil rights, defamation, employment disputes, and business litigation. He has earned recognition as one of Minnesota's top lawyers, holding numerous accolades such as being named to Minnesota Super Lawyers consistently for more than 25 years. He is also deeply involved in the community, contributing to legal, civic, and charitable organizations. Senator Ron Latz represents Senate District 46, which includes St. Louis Park, Hopkins, and Edina. Serving in the Minnesota Senate since 2007, he chairs the Senate Judiciary and Public Safety Budget and Policy Committee. Before joining the Senate, Latz was a member of the Minnesota House of Representatives, and before that, the St. Louis Park City Council. He has also served as an Assistant Attorney General for Minnesota, and is currently an attorney in private practice at Latz Law Office. It's a pleasure having both of you here. Now let's let people have a voice to go together with the name. So Andy, it's so nice to have you here.
Rabbi, pleasure to be with you.
Silky smooth tones. And Ron, how you doing?
I'm doing great, thank you. It's a pleasure also.
Amazing. Thank you both. This is exciting for me. It's a passion for me. It's something that I think is deeply meaningful. Let's get right into it. Justice. It's a heavy word. It's a word that contains a lot. It means a lot of different things to different people. With Rosh Hashanah coming up very soon, what is justice? I think I looked up in the Merriam-Webster dictionary, and it said basically a system that maintains that which is just. Defining a word with itself. Not a great start. What determines what is just? How do we follow that? Where does that come from? And that's something I want to explore with you today. Let's start with, I guess, probably the biggest of all questions. Let's just jump right in. Why do bad things happen to good people? It's something that Jews have grappled with forever, going back all the way to Moses. Maimonides very famously talks about it. And people all the time, when they experience suffering, and there's a host of it in this world, people have the question of why do bad things happen to good people? So I just want to ask both of you, Ron and Andy, does this question something that bothers you on a visceral level? Is this something that bothers you on an intellectual level? Is this something that you even think about? I want to start with you, Ron.
I would have to say that I don't think a lot about it. I think a human's natural reaction if something bad happens to them is, why me? Because I think we all tend to have a perception that we're good people, that we're somehow exceptional, that we don't deserve bad things that come along. And I understand that reaction. But that kind of presupposes that there's some reason why something happens, right? That there's some moral arc of the universe that's causing a bad thing to happen to an individual. And I'm not sure I can get to that. we have a lot of choices in what we do. We put ourselves in positions, and when good things happen to us, we say, well, we've worked hard for that. We created our opportunities so that when there's an opening there, we can take advantage of it and something good will come of it, whether it's a professional or it's an opportunity to help someone through a hard time. But when bad things happen, I think it's sort of similar. Things come along, we react the way we do as normal human beings, and sometimes it doesn't work out the way we hope it will. Sometimes it's just the way it is. And to me, the test really is not whether something is good or bad when it happens. And of course, those terms are open for conversation also, but how do we handle it? How do we respond? And to answer that question, I think we bring our own life experiences, our own moral guidance, our own education and training and whatever influences our judgment, religious beliefs or other things.
Andy, what about you? Do you think about the question, why do bad things happen to good people? Is that something that consumes you at all?
For a long time, it really did. I thought about it a lot and was troubled by it. When I started to study some 20 years ago with the Kollel here in Minnesota and Minneapolis, I learned many things, one of which most important and goes to this question really in an interesting way, is the cornerstone of Judaism, which is humility. And that relates to this question. Things happen to people as part of the tapestry of life. And I believe in a higher power, in Hashem. And while it may appear as though for that person it's a horrific event, and it may well be, in fact, but in the greater scheme of humanity, it needed to happen in order for something else to happen. Maybe something else very good to happen to that person down the road. So at the time that it occurs, you may not understand it all. And even in hindsight, and it may not be until the afterlife that you fully understand. The state of Israel being reestablished is arguably a good example of this. But humility is important for us to all recognize that none of us is that important in the grand scheme of life. Of course, it doesn't help when something has befallen you that is very negative. But we should also remember all of the wonderful things, including every day when we wake up and see the sunrise.
Andy, I was in your office actually once. Rabbi Shalom Kamenetsky from the Philadelphia Yeshiva came and spoke. So somebody got up and asked, where was God in the Holocaust to Rabbi Kamenetsky? So he asked the person, he says, are you a survivor or are children of survivors? So the guy said, no. He said, okay, then I can answer your question. He says, let me tell you why I said that. He said, there's two types of questions. There's intellectual questions and emotional questions. Intellectual questions you can answer with intellect. You can't answer an emotional question with intellect. He says, if you're a survivor or a child of survivors, so then your question is not an intellectual one. It's an emotional one. There's pain. There's a deep-seated unease. Something's bothering you, troubling you. There's no intellectual answer that I can give that's going to answer that. If you're not and you're just intellectually curious, so then fine. So what I really want to get to, we could all sit here and pontificate and theorize and whatever, but I really like to get onto the real human level. What are we feeling? What really motivates us? The notion that I'm accountable to something other than myself, right? There's parts of it that we love as human beings. There's parts of it that we don't love as human beings. Ron, what would you say the benefits are of being accountable to something bigger than yourself, outside of yourself? It could be a spouse, it could be another human being, it could be society as a whole, it can be a deity, it could be a God. Why is it good for people to be accountable to something other than themselves?
Well, I'm certainly accountable to my spouse, and also in the role that I play in elected office to the community that I represent in a very real sense. I think it's good to have a set of standards that you're not constantly adjusting to fit your own personal circumstances or finding an excuse to adjust because it doesn't fit within your preconceived notion of what you are or ought to be or what you want to accomplish. You've got an external pole, if you will, to measure yourself by. And so, like you say, whether it's a deity, whether it's some other source of moral guidance, whether it's directly out of the Torah, or whether it's, some other broader Judeo-Christian, understanding of principles in the United States, we have laws. Some countries are not as careful about them. I think our laws are pretty good in general, and we are judged every day by whether we comply with those laws too. Sometimes that circumscribes behavior. And so there's a value, I suppose, to having an external reference point for judgment, which may be more powerful in some circumstances than an internal guidepost. Part of it depends on how much you internalize those external reference points.
Those external guideposts that we're talking about, is it important that those external guideposts are fixed and unchanging? You talk about in the political field, for obviously the idea of conservative and progressive. Not that I want to make this political podcast, but correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems to be that the general conservative element is that we shouldn't have those external guideposts changing, and the progressive is, no, we should have those external guideposts changing and progressing in some way, shape, or form. We should be getting better as a people. So, Andy, do you think it's important that those external guideposts are fixed and don't change, or maybe we do need to change those as time goes on?
My thinking on most issues stems from the foundational belief that we have societal mores, ethics that we live by that are unchangeable. It doesn't matter who's in power. It doesn't matter what your fellow may believe at a given time or how they might evolve from a young adult to a senior. There aren't many, but there are certain fundamental and foundational moral values that we need to live by. And it can't change on a whim. And so, moral relativism and you have a group of friends and they believe in a certain thing, you lose them and you go to some other friends and they believe in another thing, and you're accountable to each of those groups at different times in your life. Therefore, your moral values shift based upon that accountability. I don't think that's a healthy way forward for anyone. And that's why believing in a higher power and the foundational values that really grow out of that belief is so important.
So, Ron, do you agree with what Andy said there about the dangers of moral relativism?
Yeah, I would say so. I would agree with Andrew on that. I would say, look, we do have foundational, moral beliefs in this country. Our most basic laws are founded on the Ten Commandments. It's what has gone into creating what we are as a country. And I think there's value to that. I mean, thou shalt not commit murder. Thou shalt not, do a variety of things, right? And those are common guideposts. Now, beyond that, there are other rules that we live by, and I think there is a value to being able to adjust those things to the times and to the understandings in our own human experience. So I'm not aware of too many groups that think we ought to remain adherent to the morals and guides that were in place 2,500 years ago without any exception, without any changes at all. But I think it is important to have some overarching values, and that stems from a lot of common sources.
So let me ask what might be a silly question, but I think it kind of gets us to the heart of this issue. I'm sure there are societies that we can look back historically and say, okay, those were amoral societies, right? And I think we'd all agree about those. However, those societies didn't see themselves as being amoral, right? Those societies looked at themselves and saw themselves, we can name names, whatever we want to do. But so, and again, it might seem like a silly question, but I want to get to the point here, which is those societies thought they were moral. Those societies thought that they were in the right. How do we know that we're in the right? The foundation that, let's say, America is built on, like you just said, is actually moral. Maybe we're the ones that are amoral and they were right.
Well, that's, I think, at the most basic level, why the belief in God and a higher power is so important. It is not about man's vagaries and views at the given time, whether it be 1,000 years ago, 100 years ago, or last month. Either your fellow, the political world, or however we want to decide what our laws are that we're going to follow. There is one fundamental law, and when you have a belief in God, I think it really ties you to those moral values, much more so than if you don't have a belief in God. And that's really the fundamental difference.
Ron, do you think you need a God or a deity to have that tether to, the right morality, or is there a way for humanity without God to figure that out?
Well, I think, first of all, different societies may have different conceptions of what God is and what God teaches, what those basic standards are. And I think we see that in today's world. You can look around the globe and you have different societies that have different views of what's moral and what's not, what their gods teach to them. Even though there are some underlying common reference points between, many of the major religions. So there's a value to that, but I think we have to be a little bit careful about, us judging others who have just as fervent a belief in their moral system. I think our society has taught us beyond the, some of the religious beginnings. There was also a beginning in the United States of religious freedom and freedom to disagree with other religious beliefs. You could come to this country, these colonies originally, and have the freedom and not have your beliefs dictated to you, even though there were certain common underlying themes. So I think some of those more basic, originally rooted in religion, but now rooted in our society's values, teachings that are common generally to us as Americans, that provide an independent reference point, whether or not you believe in God. And whether it's a utilitarian approach, community is better off as a whole because we allow this and we don't allow that, or whether it's a moral approach, whether it's a selfish approach. I think there is an independent reference point that's valuable to have, regardless of one individual's belief in God or what that God says or believes.
I would just add that, and I agree with a lot of what Ron has said, but at its core, the difference between being accountable to another person or just to yourself, or living by the credo, be good, and being accountable to a God or a higher power with the concept of religious freedom in terms of what and who your God is, I think is a real difference. There is a real difference there. And being accountable to God, I think makes a big difference in a society. And over the millennia, that has been seen.
I think we should differentiate between a external guide to society and maybe individuals. In other words, given that we don't all agree on everything, we're all going to be different. So when you're talking about a broad society with a diverse group of people, I think the only practical way to move forward is with a certain pluralistic attitude where, people can coexist with each other and everybody can kind of do their thing.
Well, freedom is a moral value in and of itself, and what Ron was talking about in terms of religious freedom allows people to, it's a part of it.
That's a true point. What I want to explore now is let's go away from society for a second and go down to the individual level, right? If we could agree that pluralism maybe is a value for society, because, like you said, freedom is a value, and just practically speaking, if we're going to try to impose our beliefs, any one person's beliefs on everybody, good luck with that. But does that pluralistic attitude translate to individual morals in the same way? In other words, should I live my life trying to, take a little bit from everybody in the world and kind of, put something together? Or on an individual level where hopefully I'm not schizophrenic and I'm consistent with myself, I can find, one path to follow, and that's the path that I want to follow. Does pluralism translate to the individual is my question.
I think it does. I am reminded of one of the things that I learned through study of Torah that I had no knowledge of prior to being in my late 30s and 40s even, and that is the story of having in one pocket the note that says, "The entire world was made for you," and in the other pocket, a note that says, "You are but dust." And living a life being accountable to something bigger than you, allows you to believe those things and to walk with humility always. And the individual in particular, at the end of the day, is answerable to God in judgment in the afterlife, but during this life is answerable to themselves. And that can be very powerful.
Okay.
I'm trying to interpret your question, Rabbi, and I'm thinking it's kind of a question of moral relativism embedded in the concept of plurality.
Okay.
And I'm not quite sure how to answer that. I mean, I think that humility is important, and trying to walk in the middle and be answerable to yourself ultimately, and your day-to-day conduct is important. I think it's also important to be open to learning new concepts, to understanding different people's beliefs, and maybe finding them persuasive enough to incorporate them into your own standards for conduct as you grow older, get more experience, and live day to day. And I certainly wouldn't want to foreclose that. I think that'd be valuable for individual learning. So I'm also reminded that there is no true freedom as a value without laws. At least that's one concept of our system of justice. Hobbes said life is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. And he was referring to sort of people living out in the woods and not having any laws constraining them or any authority controlling them. And it was just a free-for-all that was nasty for everyone. And an ordered society gives room for an awful lot of individual freedom, which also means that others can't necessarily cross the line into impeding on your freedom without crossing the line from legal to illegal as well. And so if you incorporate some of that into your own viewpoints about what's appropriate conduct, what's going to constrain you, what's going to guide your conduct on a day-to-day basis as you're dealing with other people, I think it's worth it to hold all those in mind at the same time and to be open to learning from others. And if that means pluralism, if that means there's some moral relativism in there, perhaps. But I think that's a sign of an important value of being a human too.
So, okay, so let me, again, I want to get more to the meat of the issue here. So does that not take away from conviction though? In other words, is it true that the more options you maintain and the more you're open to different things, the less you can have conviction about any one particular thing?
I don't think they're two inconsistent concepts.
Okay.
I mean, certainly, if you are so rock solid in your conviction about something that you absolutely could never have your mind changed, you wouldn't even be open to new information.
Right.
To me, that feels very doctrinaire and rigid.
Okay.
It leaves no room for growth as a human being, intellectually, spiritually, in any other way. There are certain foundational values which I find important, but even the commandment that says "Thou shalt not murder" has exceptions,
right,
such as in self-defense or to protect the life of another.
Right.
So I think we have to have a certain level of openness to input that might adjust our convictions. And, I guess it depends. There are some people who feel absolutely convinced that their way in the world is the only way. And anyone else that disagrees with it either should be outcast or killed. And I'm not sure I can go that far. There is a part of me that says I've got a pretty firm set of beliefs in what I think is appropriate, but there are others, as long as it doesn't stop me from living the life that I think is valuable and moral to live, that I wouldn't shut them down unless, there are certain things, certain lines that I think that would be completely inappropriate to cross and I think would be appropriate for society to stop.
Any of your thoughts?
Well, it becomes tricky when you say there are certain lines that would be inappropriate to cross, but why? Infanticide at a time was accepted in society. And what makes it inherently wrong or abhorrent, other than men coming together and deciding, well, we think it's wrong and abhorrent, and so we're going to stop doing it. And I think what the answer to what really makes it wrong and abhorrent is the teachings of God. Now, does that mean your belief in your religious deity or God or higher power is intended to control everyone else if they don't believe? At least in Judaism, that has never been the case. We don't proselytize nor try to bring into the religion and require and demand that everyone in the world believes what we know to be true. Not at all. However, we live a certain way because of our connection and relationship to God.
I've got a story on the tip of my tongue that I want to share. I think the only way that we're going to actually have these conversations if we say things that might be slightly uncomfortable to people, but at the risk of slightly offending somebody, I'll say this story. So this story happened probably, 25, 30 years ago in Atlanta. I'm from Atlanta, grew up there. And the rabbi of the synagogue that I grew up in was in a meeting of different congregational rabbis. And the topic of gay marriage came up. And this happened, again, this would never happen today, but 30 years ago in Atlanta, the leader of a Reform congregation got up and said, we don't accept that type of behavior in our congregation. We're a family-friendly synagogue, and, we don't welcome that. It's the Reform rabbi saying this. So the Orthodox rabbi gets up and says, with all due respect, you're a bigot. To the Reform rabbi. The Reform rabbi says, to the Orthodox rabbi says, you mean you accept gay marriage? So he says, no. He says, I don't. But when I say that I'm against gay marriage, it's not my opinion. It's what it says in the Torah. It's what God says. When you say it, it's your opinion. So you're a bigot. That was the story that happened. Is that a distinction that matters? Is that a fair statement? That's both of you. Or is that just an excuse to have your own opinions and blame it on God?
At the start of a lot of the questions that we have it comes back to, and has already in this discussion, belief in God. Where does that leave the atheist, etc.? But it's not just a belief in God. It's a belief that God wrote the Torah. And that's yet another step. There are many believe that there are numerous proofs of that fact, and it really allows them to cement their understanding and belief in God and in Torah. But I'll say that if that is where you what your frame of reference is, you're going to have a series, a group of moral values that will be unchanging. While you might allow others to live a different life, for you, it will be unchanging.
And I do think, to be honest, that is the Orthodox viewpoint. The people that I know, the belief is morality is unchanging, and it's absolute, and it is from God. And while morality has to be applied, it is unchanging. And the goal of this is not to get into a theological conversation. That's not the point. But the goal is to gain a level of understanding as far as what people's perceptions are. What I would like to see more, Orthodox people understand is that just because you have a belief and you have conviction in it doesn't mean that you should necessarily project that onto everybody else and subject everybody else to the same thing. What bothers maybe some Orthodox people is that, what's wrong with having moral conviction? Why is that a bad thing? And I guess if somebody, obviously isn't coming from that same source, I can understand why somebody wouldn't have that. But I guess my question is, do you think people, outside of the Orthodox community can have respect for moral conviction? Or is it just seen as some sort of kind of archaic, outdated type of thing?
I think that those of us outside the Orthodox community ought to have respect for moral conviction, but how that gets played out, I think, is important. The Torah may say gay marriage is immoral, but it also says those who engage in that conduct should be stoned to death, and says the same thing about adulterers, right? Yet I don't know that any Orthodox community today would try to implement, those punishments for what they would define as immoral behavior. So even to that point, the Orthodox community has progressed, I would say, is progressive in that sense, even if they choose not to condone the behavior. And so at some level, I suppose one from outside the community would admire a certain amount of moral conviction, and would want those communities to be able to live as they wish. But when you're talking about a broader pluralistic society, which we do live in, then you get into questions of democracy, majority rule, minority rights. What kind of standards are we going to set as a society that allows groups to adhere to their own standards of conduct without imposing barriers or conditions on other groups that may believe differently on that particular topic?
And I think that's a real distinction too. I think there is a big difference, even in halacha, just from an Orthodox standpoint. There's separate laws for Jews and separate laws for non-Jews. One of the 7 Noahide laws is to have a court system. Now, what exactly those particulars of that court system are not defined. In other words, for the rest of the world, have a court system. And however you decide to make that court system, you have to have some set of standards, some set of measures that people are held accountable to. But whatever those are don't really matter as much as you actually have a system. Obviously, when it comes to us, we believe that the Torah is more specific, in very particular ways. So this balance of having one set of standards, which is societal and up to society to decide, yet also have a set of standards, which is, God's, which is very strict and rigid and not changing. I think both those concepts are things that exist within the Orthodox world as well. So I think sometimes people think like it's all or nothing. This is the way, or again, for the general world, in a world that doesn't recognize any set of judgment, that's fine. Just have a set of standards, whatever those standards are. It's up to society to decide. There is a place in the world for the ultimate goal, which is God's standards. There's a famous statement in the Talmud, famous story in the Talmud that talks about the famous Hillel and Shammai, the sages Hillel and Shammai. And there was a guy that came to Shammai and he said, "Teach me the Torah while standing on one foot." The famous story in the Talmud. Teach me the Torah standing on one foot. And I think the Talmud says that Shammai pushed him away, but there's a detail there that many people don't know. It says he pushed him away with a builder's ruler, like a yardstick of a builder. Amas habinyan is the Hebrew term. He pushed him away with a builder's yardstick. So the guy left, and then the guy went to Hillel, and he said, "Hillel, teach me the Torah on one foot." And Hillel said, "That which is hateful you don't do to your friend," right? And it's a famous story in the Talmud. So I once heard somebody say a brilliant insight. He said, "What's with the builder's ruler?" And what was this conversation between Shammai and Hillel? See, what was going on is the following. Shammai came to him. He said, "Teach me the Torah on one foot." Like, what does it mean to be a good person? So he took out this absolute yardstick, which is God's measuring stick. He said, "Okay, here's God's yardstick. All the laws in the Torah, every single detail. Do you measure up to this?" No, of course not. Get out of here. Right? And so Shammai's approach was, you don't measure up to the objective standard that God has for people. So, I can't teach you. Then he went to Hillel. And Hillel took a different approach. Hillel said, that which you hate, don't do to somebody else, which is a subjective standard, meaning don't be duplicitous. In other words, maybe you can't measure up to the yardstick of God, the objective yardstick, but whatever you value, don't do to somebody else. Can you at least measure up to your own subjective standards? And if you can do that, Hillel said, well, then we could start there and then build our way up. This might not be a popular opinion, but when I see the coexist bumper stickers, it's uninspiring to me. It's uninspiring. Why is it uninspiring? Because, imagine in a marriage, right? You came to your spouse and you said, "Honey, can we coexist? You live your life, I'll live my life, and we won't get in each other's way." Right? It's hardly an inspiring ideal. I mean, the ideal in any relationship should be cooperation, right? It should be we're working together towards a common cause, right? Obviously, in today's world, we're so far from that. Humanity is so far from that common cause that the best we can hope for is coexistence, right? Which means basically live and let live.
I would say it a bit differently, that the relationship, we should strive for cooperation. I think it's probably co-creation. We want to co-create a relationship together as opposed to coexist,
right?
As you point out. The other thing that you said that struck me, and that I understand may well be the teaching in Judaism as well, is as it relates to judgment. We are judged not with the same ruler, as Shammai might argue, but a special ruler. Every yardstick is unique to that individual. that the judge, or that God will judge them on. And so if you were born into a family and were raised and were given certain abilities to be a tzaddik from the beginning, and you didn't move from that point, you may be judged harshly, despite the fact that you're a tzaddik, as opposed to the person who was born in a very impoverished and uneducated family and no moral value teachings, and you excelled and broke out of that and became, a very moral contributor to society. You may be judged immensely, albeit, maybe you were not president of this or that, but you may be judged quite more favorably.
I agree with that, yeah.
There is a story in the Torah, as I recall, that basically says when you die and go to heaven and you apologize to God for not having lived up to the standards of some other sage in Judaism, and God says, I'm not judging you for not being that person. I'm judging you for why you aren't yourself. So I think that's exactly what Andrew is referring to as well. I mean, we have to live up to our own standards. But to Hillel's point, to kind of flip it a little bit, it's not only do not to others what would be hateful to you, but what is your internal reference point as to what is hateful and what isn't?
Sure.
I think we should take everyone where they are and try to teach them what we think are universal moral values. But there's a job of the community as well as a job of an individual to try to inculcate those values in the individual persons. And so Hillel does take them where they are, but there's got to be some reference points, some good standards that they're judging others by.
Right. And then that's I guess the point, that there has to be some, you have to have an absolute yardstick to then measure the relative yardsticks relative to.
Well, I would agree, but I think there's a disagreement on what that actual yardstick is.
Correct. I agree with that.
And I suspect there's disagreement within the Orthodox community
for sure
on many of those points, and there's certainly disagreements between the Orthodox and the non-Orthodox Jewish community as to what those points are, and then you get, to beyond Judaism as well. There's some commonalities and there's some differences. So, who is to define what is the absolutely correct standard that we are all to be judged by?
Well, society steps in, and it's another point that I think you've made in the past to me, Rabbi, and that is God can judge the person. We can't. We can judge the conduct that the person engaged in. Now, there are aggravating and mitigating circumstances, as Ron and I both know as lawyers, as we discuss this.
Sure.
But it's the conduct, and as long as we have certain rules and moral values that we apply to that conduct, we can, as a society, meet our moral obligations to one another. But in the end, it's only God that will judge.
But to circle back, you bring in justice and judgment and all of that, and Andrew and I are both lawyers. We work in the civil justice system or the criminal justice system. I do a lot of criminal defense work, and I represent people who are good people who have bad days, sometimes really bad days. I've got some clients who are not so good people, and they have what's for them are normal days. But each time, I'm trying to find a way within my practice to look for the mitigating factors, to look for the humanity in the people that I represent, and to try to fashion an outcome that makes some sense from that standpoint is not merely an absolute condemnation and then absolute punishment, absent the context and the situation. And certainly there are things, some people need to be punished very severely for what they do. And there are other circumstances where that may not be appropriate. So here we have humans judging humans' conduct. Mm-hmm. And the rhetoric certainly includes a lot of judgment of the person.
Right.
But that's the implementation of the questions of justice in the civil society that we live in, as well as, where does God come in
Right.
On that judgment and those standards?
So I think, we're in agreement that there has to be some sort of framework from which, general morality is built off of. Obviously, there's different, opinions on that, but there has to be some sort of, bigger yardstick, as it were. And then once we have that bigger yardstick in place, then each individual, has to implement it on their own, and we have to allow for, people to explore their own way. And ultimately, each person is held accountable to themselves, maybe to a higher authority, but that's up to them. What I mentioned to you before is that maybe we can judge particular actions within a society. We have to, otherwise we don't have a society. But judging people in the aggregate, based on their actions is something that we can't possibly do. That's something that I firmly believe in as well, that you can't absolutely judge a person. I have one last point that I wanted to make. I know, Jeff, we're over time, but you good? Okay. One thing that always fascinated me about law, and you had mentioned this before, is that, it seems like the entire legal and political process is basically a balancing act between law and liberty, right? The more law you have, the less liberty you have. The more liberty you have, the less law you have. There actually is a way to have both law and liberty, and when they're not at odds with each other. There's a statement in the Talmud that says that true freedom is somebody who has Torah. Now, the way that's derived is it says the Ten Commandments were engraved onto the tablets. And the word for engraved is charus in Hebrew. And the word for freedom is cherus. And there's something about the words being engraved into the stone that allows for freedom and law to coexist. And what that means is the following. Most law is an external set of rules superimposed over the will of the person. I want to get to where I want to go as fast as I can, so I want to speed. But we recognize societally that if everybody did that, it'd be chaos. So therefore, we have to create this external system that superimposes its will over the will of the individual, over the will of the person. That's where you get this conflict between law and liberty. I want to speed. The law doesn't let me. So then we just can talk about exactly, what that balance is. And that's pretty much the entire legal and, political arena. There's another way to do this. In a system where the laws are superimposed on top of the will of the people, you have a conflict. There is a way to engrave the law into the heart of the people, as opposed to, ink on parchment, which is superimposed. You engrave it in to where the society doesn't want to do the wrong thing. If people don't want to do the wrong thing, then you have liberty and you have law, because people want to do what's right. That requires more education than cops, right? And, one thing that I think we all should strive for, whether we're talking about, America in general, or our own small communities, our own families, is that the more we invest in education, the more we invest in giving people a set of values and teaching them you don't want to do things wrong, right? The less you have to use the law as a cudgel to get people to stay in line. So I think that's just whenever I think of justice, we usually think of justice as being something that's superimposed from the outside. But the more we educate people, the more we educate ourselves, the more we want to be good and moral people, the more we want to do the right thing, the less law and liberty are at odds with each other.
It reminds me of what we talked about earlier, but I had been studying with Rabbi Gibber at the Kollel about the God of justice. And if you genuinely, in your heart, believe in that to the core of your being, as well as using the Word of God, the Torah, as a guidepost in life, the secular laws are quite easy to stay within, to the point where they become non-existent in many respects.
I would think the secular laws in a lot of ways reflect some of those basic moral principles.
Yeah, maybe
as
that's
well,
why.
with some religious foundation along the way. There was a sociologist named Kai T. Erickson that wrote a book called The Wayward Puritans.
Okay.
And in that society, it was illegal for a male to walk outside without a hat on. It was criminal conduct worthy of being expelled from the community if you violated that law. And that is how society defined its boundaries and therefore defined itself as acceptable behavior. But sometimes the laws are made for the 10% of society that is not going to incorporate them inside their own persons and follow them willingly because that's what they believe in.
Sure, of course.
Is to protect ourselves against the 10% that may assault us, may think that they can take whatever is not theirs without any consequences and so on. And so maybe that's why we have the padlocks
Right,
and the
you
police
both.
sometimes.
Oh, of course, yeah.
And in some communities, it's a bigger issue than in other communities. Right.
This is a lot easier to marry for us because in our country, Judeo-Christian values are the foundation of many, not most, of our laws and certainly our founding.
Okay, well, I want to be respectful of your time. Thank you so much for coming out here. This has been what I consider to be the beginning of a conversation because there's still so much more to talk about. But to me, if you can leave off with just a couple of takeaways, I guess I'll start. To me, the biggest thing that came out of the conversation is the idea that, we have to balance, on the one hand, having some sort of bigger framework of what morality is with allowing people to have their own beliefs and not superimposing, those rigid structures upon them. To me, that's a big deal. And I think that's something that we're roughly all in agreement on, on that point. What do you come up with, Ron?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think we have common ground that there are some common standards here, and it's important to recognize those. But also that, the laws that we live under in a pluralistic society, may reflect much of that. But at some level, I think we can also agree that humans fall short of living up to all of those standards, and that we have to leave room for people to have a certain amount of independent choice. Maybe I shouldn't speak for all of us. Certainly, that's what I believe is a takeaway, that we also have some level of independent choice and, how we live our lives, certainly to the extent that it doesn't impose or impede others. But also, I think there are some broader moral standards. We might disagree on what those are. Right. And they might not be the same as they were 5,000 years ago.
Sure. Thank you. Andy, what are your takeaways?
First, the importance of belief in a higher power in order to meet the judgment day in a positive way rather than negative, and to live by a set of moral convictions which are derived from that higher power, and having sufficient humility in order to understand that the world doesn't revolve around you, and but yet know that your treatment of others will be judged. Not judged by others in a courtroom, but judged by the Almighty Judge.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I really appreciate you both coming in, and hopefully this inspires more conversations.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Thanks for joining us for another episode of Two Jews, One Opinion, where we explore the heart of what unites us as one people. If you enjoyed today's conversation, be sure to subscribe, leave a review, and share with a friend. Stay connected, stay curious, and remember, no matter how many opinions we have, we're all part of the same story. Until next time.